So, as the economy is doing well in the 1950s, more and more people can afford to build and buy houses, as I mentioned earlier. So, the population starts to shift away from urban areas or cities, to suburban areas. So, these communities that are in between cities and agricultural rural farmlands to occupy this middle ground. By 1960, more people lived in suburbs than in rural or urban areas in the United States. Part of the reason that suburbs are popular is that land is more available, it's cheaper, and with more and more Americans owning cars, it's possible for Americans to live in the suburbs and still commute to work in cities during this time period. There's a big spike in home ownership aided by the GI Bill and mortgage help for veterans. The number of homes in the United States doubles in the 1950s as there's a huge housing construction boom. This is why it's very common to see suburbs and neighborhoods dating to the 1950s in cities across the United States. Part of the reason for the housing boom is mass construction methods enable cheaper builds of houses. Government mortgage loan programs also make it more possible for veterans to afford homes. So the average cost of houses are dropping because of more efficient construction methods at the same time that more and more Americans qualify for government assistance due to their veteran status. So more Americans are able to buy homes during this time period. A classic example of a post-World War II suburban development is Levittown. Levittown was built on Long Island by brothers William and Alfred Levitt, who purchased 1,200 acres of farmland on Long Island, and on that built 10,000 homes. Part of the reason that Levittown was so attractive and so affordable was that the houses were largely prefabricated, which meant that because they were already pre-constructed in certain pieces, it was very easy and quick to put them up and finish them. And to further keep costs down, the Levitt brothers made it so that the floor plans were fairly similar, very uniform. You could choose different exteriors for your house, but for the most part, these houses were fairly similar. About 40,000 people moved to the development of Levittown, and we're going to see similar suburban developments pop up across the United States during the 1950s and 60s. Now, suburban living, in addition to people still having to now commute into urban areas via car, is also going to change the way Americans shop. In particular, when Americans live in urban areas, it's less attractive to own a car because then you have to worry about things like parking, which is oftentimes difficult in urban centers. And so most Americans living in cities will walk or use public transit to commute to work, but also to go to stores. Now, in a suburb where things are very much spread out, you can't do that as easily. And so this is where we get the phenomenon of shopping malls, centralized locations where you had businesses all in one place that you might need to go shopping at, that you could park at with your car in their giant parking lots. So this changes the way Americans shop because previously Americans tended to go to more specialty stores for different items. So you go to a butcher for your meat, you go to a bakery for your bread, you'd maybe go to a produce vendor, right, for your fruits and vegetables. Now Americans are increasingly going to supermarkets, right, where all of those things are under one roof, one-stop shopping. So this means that suburbs are essentially designed for you to have a car. They're not very walkable. And in fact, this is oftentimes a critique leveled against suburbs by design folks, is that they don't facilitate easy access for people who live there unless you have a car, because mass transit usually is not as available in these areas as it is in the inner city. And speaking of cities, we still have growth of cities during this time period. In particular, cities in the West have a huge influx in population. More than 30 million Americans will move west of the Mississippi River between 1945 and 1975. And in the 1950s, about 20% of all population growth in the United States happens in California. So, as Americans are moving west for job opportunities, we're going to see the growth of Western cities like Los Angeles, Phoenix, Houston, and you'll start to see a different phenomenon with these cities that experience growth during the post-war period versus earlier ones. Traditionally, older cities in the East, like for example, Philadelphia, Boston, Richmond, Detroit, will all have a urban center, so a downtown where businesses and things are located. And then as the city grows and as we get suburban expansion, the city will be ringed, right, by suburbs. So you have an inner core where your businesses are, and then you have kind of residents outside that. In Western cities like Houston and Phoenix and Los Angeles, you have something that looks a little different. Here, these are called centerless cities. So essentially, what happens is while there's still a main downtown in these areas, there are also different centers of business and industry around the cities. So you have several business centers and several residential areas strewn throughout these cities, and they're connected by highways. These cities do not rely on public transportation. In fact, Los Angeles actively dismantled much of their public transit system in the 1950s to make room for freeways. And about a third of Southern California is paved over during the post-war period to meet this demand for transportation by building highways. Houston is a classic example of a centerless city. If you look at maps of Houston, you can see, looking at both Google Maps or Google Earth, if you pull up Houston, you can see just how big the sprawl is of the city. Houston is actually one of the largest cities by area in the United States. You can also see multiple rings of highways around Houston. So I am originally from Houston. I'm from the north of Houston, and you can see by looking at a map, you kind of have an inner ring by the 610 loop, but you also have now almost 2 full rings outside that are increasingly large and spanning the perimeter of the sprawling city of Houston. Americans need automobiles in order to navigate these new cities and these new suburbs. And by 1960, 80% of American families have at least one car, and about 14% of American families have more than one car. Most of the cars that consumers are buying during this time period are exclusively American built. And in what will be a great irony if you're a classic car fan, these cars in the 1950s are built to purposely fall out of style in a few years. Yes, that's right. Kind of the classic image of 1950s cars would be 57 Chevys, right? Very iconic with big tail fins and lots of chrome. Those were meant to be kind of fashion trends that would quickly fall out of style. So the idea is that you wanted to get Americans to purchase cars every few years because the style of their car had become outdated, right? So that they wanted to upgrade to be in the latest current fashion. The automobile industry helped sustain Detroit, which is still a major manufacturing center during the 1950s and home to massive automobile plants like Ford's River Rouge plant and the Willow Run plant, which was originally built to build airplanes during World War II and then converted to car manufacture. Tens of thousands of employees worked at each of these plants for Ford. The car changed Americans' lives. Not only are they now able to live in suburbs and commute to work in the interior or go, drive to the local grocery store, your shopping strip mall. But Americans also now embrace motels or roadside hotels, drive-in theaters, which are very popular during the time period. So there's a big screen, and then you could drive in with your car and have a little speaker mounted to your car so you could hear the movie and watch it from the comfort of your car. And fast food restaurants located along roadsides with drive-throughs. One of the earliest fast food franchises is McDonald's, began in Illinois in 1954 by Roy Kroc. By 1964, within their first decade, McDonald's had 700 locations across the United States and had sold 400 million hamburgers. Okay. So Americans now are increasingly getting their food through drive-throughs, so you don't even have to park your car and go inside. I mean, think about it. How many of y'all have patronized a drive-through recently, especially now that dining rooms are closed due to coronavirus as of the recording of this podcast? But the car actually becomes a symbol of financial security and freedom, right? That you are wealthy enough to sustain having a car, that you have a sense of independence, right? Like you're not bound to the bus schedule, right? To be able to go places, you can just get in your car and go. And so this gives Americans this sense of freedom to be able to move wherever they want, whenever they want. And part of what enables them to actually go wherever they want is the construction of the interstate highway system. The interstate highway system was first proposed after World War I, as more and more Americans during the 1920s are getting cars. They're finding a problem being able to get around in their cars because of a lack of paved roads, especially over long distances. So during President Eisenhower's time in office, the interstate highway system is finally greenlit, which is why we call it the Eisenhower Interstate System. And 41,000 miles of highway are built across the United States to connect states. This system was justified because it would benefit American economy by facilitating transport via trucking, right, that we still see as vital today. That would be beneficial to suburban developers to better connect suburban areas with cities. That it'd be helpful for the automobile industry to, again, promote more Americans from buying cars. However, one key bit of justification in finally getting Congress to approve funds for this massive infrastructure project was, and don't laugh, that interstate highways would enable people to quickly evacuate urban centers in the event of a nuclear attack. Yes, I know, contain your laughter. You're at home thinking, my God, did none of these designers think of rush hour traffic? And yeah, no, there was a lot of optimism on the ability of interstate highway systems to handle high capacity traffic and not get jammed. But as anybody living near a major highway knows and has experienced during the commute, during rush hour, this evacuation system doesn't work quite as planned. Especially think about it in the context of natural disasters. Again, talking about Houston, there is always a huge traffic jam when people evacuate for hurricanes, like we saw during Harvey most recently and Ike previously, right? That the interstate highway system, as it is constructed today, does not have the capacity to meet the demand for people in their cars. Okay, but that was one of the things that was floated as justification, that in theory, it would help us evacuate faster in the event of a nuclear attack.